Now, we're continuing on in our sermon series called Heroes of the Bible, and this morning we're talking about Moses. Before we get into talking about him, I just want to share with you a story that I absolutely love. Now, in a little over 7 months, we will have the next Olympic Games, the Winter Games, and it's going to be in Italy next year. And the Olympics are an amazing display of perseverance and excellence. The world's greatest athletes coming together for athletic greatness and intense competition. But my absolute favorite part of the Olympics are the heartwarming stories that are often woven throughout the 16 days, that at times have nothing to do with sports or the events themselves. Stories of athletes who overcome challenges, who help one another, who defy all odds to even get to the events. That's what I am here for the Olympics. And one of the best stories that I've heard came out of the 1992 Summer Olympics held in Barcelona. The event was the 400-meter race, and Derek Redmond, an athlete from Great Britain, was favored to win the entire event. He was favored for gold. When just under halfway through one of the races, Derek stopped, grabbed his hamstring, and fell to the ground. While medics came to check him out, he stood up and started hobbling down the track in visible pain from what we now know was a hamstring tear. Suddenly, a man rushes onto the track, pushing past Olympic security, and he puts his hand around Derek's waist. The man was Derek's father. It would later be shared that the father said to him as he held him, "You have nothing to prove here. You don't have to do this." To which Derek replied, "Yes, I do." With his father there to steady him, Derek's father said, "Then we'll finish this race together." A beautiful story of not only a father's love, but a story that highlights the importance of showing up for one another and the blessing that comes when we rely on our community of people. How beautiful it is knowing that there was someone there to journey to the end through the tough time, to lean on, to encourage him, to hold him steady until he reached the finish line. Now, as I read through our passage of scripture for this morning, I couldn't help but think of Moses. Moses, who also knew what it meant to be held up by people when things got tough, when he endured the difficult and trying moments. Now, I think I've shared before that Moses is one of my absolute favorite characters in the Bible. And part of that is because it's through Moses' story, through Moses standing by the burning bush, that I received my calling as to become an officer in the Salvation Army. Moses is a flawed individual. I can relate to that. And he's an unlikely hero of the Bible and an extremely reluctant leader. That is not what he wanted to do, was lead the people. Chapter 3 and most of chapter 4 is about God pleading with Moses to go back to Egypt to save his people, and Moses giving a long list of reasons why that was not what he wanted to do, why he was in fact the wrong guy for the job. Now, as we know, eventually Moses decides to go back to Egypt, but he has the assurance that people like Aaron will help him with speaking, and also the promise that God will lead him. As we read Exodus, we see that Moses' task was to lead a reluctant people who seemingly struggled to see God show up in their story. Now, don't get me wrong, I get it. The Israelites' story is often one of torment, of trauma, and of tragedy. But it's also a story of God's presence, of his provision, and of his protection. In Exodus 11, we read about the plague on the firstborn sons. God spared the Israelites with the Lord's Passover, God's protection over the firstborn. In Exodus 12, we read about the Israelites finally being set free after years of captivity, God's presence in the Exodus from Egypt. Or in Exodus 14, when we read about the crossing through the Red Sea, God's provision of a path on dry land. At the end of chapter 15 through until the beginning of chapter 17, just before our passage of scripture, the Israelite people seemed reluctant to trust in their God, even though all of that had taken place. And it says through each portion of scripture that they complained, or they grumbled amongst themselves. They even wrestled with Moses. God provided for their basic needs of food, of water, and continued freedom. And still, after each challenge they faced, the people would grumble and complain to Moses. And so I can understand if Moses became a little reluctant to trust the people that he was leading. They had not proven to be a people who would rise to the occasion, but that didn't seem to be a problem for Moses. By the time we get to Exodus 17, verses 8 to 16, our text for this morning, it seems as though Moses had stepped in beautifully to his role as leader of the Israelite people. Verse 8 tells us that the Amalekites attacked the Israelite people, and without hesitation, Moses laid out a plan. He said to Joshua in verse 9, "Choose some of our men and go out and fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on the hill with the staff of God in my hands." This is not simply a task or a challenge for Moses. Moses engages the people in his community because he sees the value of working with his community. He brings Joshua into the plan and asks him to gather a group of men, a group of warriors who could go out onto the battlefield. And then in verse 10, it says, "So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill." Once again, we see the importance of community. Just as Joshua isn't going out onto the battlefield alone, Moses isn't going up on that hill by himself either. Aaron and Hur are part of the community that he engages to defeat the Amalekites. Moses rallies his community of people for one common goal. He relies on his community, and he recognizes the importance of community. So Moses went up to the hill with the staff of God in his hands, and he raised it up, and incredible things started to happen. It says in verse 11, "As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning." And it continues in verse 12 to show the power of Moses' community at work. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up so that his hands remained steady till sunset. Isn't this a powerful image? A beautiful display of people coming together for one common goal. This was a task that Moses was unable to accomplish on his own. And so his people rallied around him, did their part, and held the weight when it was too much for him to do on his own, when he became too weak. Living in community can be an incredible blessing. Moses was witness to the importance of community, and Scripture talks about the importance of living in community. The fact that we are actually created to be in community. Genesis 2:18 says, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make him a helper as his partner." Hebrews 10 encourages believers not to give up meeting together. And Ecclesiastes 4 says, two are better than one. We were created to live in community. It's a wonderful, beautiful, and holy thing to be part of a church family. And yet, that doesn't mean it's always easy. The passages of Scripture from Exodus prove that living within a community can be incredibly difficult. We see it with the Israelites, times when people act poorly, grumbled, wrestled with God, wrestled with Moses, complained. But friends, let's remember this was a time when they were wandering the desert without a home to go back to and no comfortable bed, no certainty of food waiting at the table, no certainty of fresh water. Some of us in our community have a roof over our heads and have food on the table and have fresh water, and we still find things to complain about, friends. Not here, of course. This is other churches I'm talking about, right? Yeah. At times, living in community, even a Christian community, can be difficult. We need to just acknowledge that now. It's not always rainbows and lollipops. People complain. People can be difficult. People can make decisions that we don't understand because it's not decisions we would make. At times, people can say and do hurtful things. Yes, living in community is an incredible blessing, and it can also be incredibly challenging. And still, I believe one example we can take from our passage of Scripture is that we can't and shouldn't do this thing called life on our own. We can't and we shouldn't do this journey of faith on our own. Just like God put Joshua and Aaron and Hur in Moses' life to ease the burden and literally lift the burden when he was tired, God has placed people in our lives to do the same for each and every one of us. Church family committed to uplifting one another in prayer, showing up with meals during difficult seasons of life, providing a shoulder to cry on, a sympathetic ear to listen, a comforting hug, bringing an iron and an ironing board because someone else needs it. People in our lives who can point us back to the cross when our eyes shift to other things. A church family willing to journey through the messy parts of life, being the hands and feet of Jesus in our broken lives, in this broken world. Friends, if you haven't seen it, look again. I have seen a community of believers here at Oshawa Temple who rally around the hurting, who show up in the darkness, who do the hard work of holding up the hands of their brothers and sisters here at Oshawa Temple, who steady the hands of their friends until the time is just right. I have been witness to it, and I have experienced myself during our time here in Oshawa. It is a blessing. While Moses experienced the challenges of not only being in community, but leading that community, he also experienced the benefits and the blessings of that community. Verse 10 of our text says, "So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill." Moses knew the blessing of living in community. He experienced the blessing of community as Joshua and the men fought out on the battlefield. He experienced the blessing of community as Aaron and Hur joined him at the top of the hill. He experienced the blessing of a friend on either side of him, literally lifting his hands to the air when he was too tired. He experienced the blessing of community when they literally carried the weight when things got too hard. But most of all, Moses experienced the blessing of God showing up for that community as a source of guidance, protection, and even victory. It says Moses heads up to the hill and brings the staff with him, and he refers to it as the staff of God in verse 9. And you might remember hearing about the staff as you've read Exodus, because it's already been used as a tool to do the will of God several times before this day on the battlefield. Whether showing signs to Pharaoh back in Egypt, or the staff being lifted up over the Red Sea and the waters parting, or the staff being used to bring water from the rock at the beginning of chapter 17, the staff of God was a prominent visual in the lives of the Israelites. And so on this day, as the Amalekites and the Israelites fought, Moses once again used the staff as a tool to remind the people of the presence of God on that day, on that battlefield. And it didn't take long for Moses to realize that while the staff was raised, his people were winning the battle. But as soon as he became tired and it dropped down, the Amalekites gained the upper hand. On that day, Moses, Aaron, and Hur were not simply standing on a hill doing nothing at all, allowing the warriors on the field to do the hard part. Those three men stood on the hill using prayer as their battleground. Prayer is an act of surrendering self and seeking God. And that is what the three men were doing on that day. It was not a last-ditch effort, but the greatest resource Moses and his people had at their disposal. So with their arms outstretched, with the staff in their hand, it was a reminder to those on the battlefield that God was here, that God was present. To see the staff of God was to see the hand of God within their very situation. A reminder to them that it was not them that was in control, it was God that was in control. Our text this morning demonstrates the ways in which God's people are interconnected with one another, but most importantly, interconnected with Him. Moses, Aaron, and Hur were to be intercessors on behalf of the Israelite people. They stood with their arms raised for an entire day, unrelenting, not for themselves, but for their community of people. Verse 15 says, Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." The Lord is my banner, Jehovah Nissi. The name of God revealed to Moses on that day, Jehovah Nissi, the Lord is my banner. And it's a name that reveals a part of the character of God as a leader and protector through the battles of life. It's the hope that God's people can overcome whatever challenges they may face. It's the encouragement that God's people can be victorious in the battles. And so Moses declared that God, Yahweh, is Jehovah Nissi. The Lord is my banner. Have you ever needed that reminder? The Lord is my banner, not just for Moses. The Lord is our banner. Have you ever gone through a week where you needed the reminder that God, my God, is Jehovah Nissi? The Lord is my banner. And that means that we have the assurance of God's presence, of God's protection, and God's victory in our lives. Friends, I have needed that reminder. Even this week, it has been welcomed as a reminder in my own life. I have needed the reminder that our God is bigger than all the mess life will throw at you. I have needed the reminder of God's presence in my life, of God's protection in my life. I have needed the reminder that because of who I belong to, because of who I serve, we have already won because our God is already victorious. And I'm confident that many of you here this morning, watching online, have also needed that reminder, perhaps even this week, perhaps even this morning. when life throws you curveballs, when worries weigh you down, when the mess seems like too much, when the valley seems too deep, when you have more questions than answers, when you feel all alone, when the grief seems overwhelming, when the complaints and the grumbling seems too loud, when the battle seems unwinnable. The Lord is your banner. The Lord is my banner. The Lord is our banner. Friends, let this be your reminder that you can plant your feet firm on the ground. You can stand up tall and you can puff out your chest because our God is Jehovah Nissi. The Lord is my banner, and that means he is present in your life. He is your protector, and he is victorious. Friends, I pray that as you go through this week, you will carry this deep truth within your heart. The Lord is our banner. In your battles, in your burdens, in the valleys, and in your victories. When Moses stood on that hill with his arms raised high, supported by Aaron and Hur, it wasn't just about winning the battle. It was about proclaiming who God is, Jehovah Nissi, the one who goes before us, the one who stands above us, the one who covers us. Just like Moses, you and I were never meant to stand alone. We're part of a community, a spiritual family, a church family called to lift one another up when the weight becomes too heavy, called to intercede for one another in prayer, and called to remind each other that the Lord still fights for his people. So let me ask you today, whose arms are you holding up? Who are you bringing to him in prayer? Who are you walking alongside, helping to steady their hands when they're weary? Or perhaps on the other side, are you allowing others to support you, to walk with you, to carry the weight when you no longer can? God didn't design you. God didn't design us to journey alone. This summer, as we continue to reflect on the heroes of the Bible, people like Moses who weren't perfect, who were often reluctant, who faced complaints and hardships and fear, let's remember that they were not heroic because of their strength, but because of their dependence on God and their willingness to lean in to community. Today, you may feel tired. You may feel like you're in the middle of the battle. Your arms might be trembling, but friends, you are not alone. Look around. Your church family is here, and above all, the Lord is here. So stand strong, lift your eyes, raise your hands, even if someone else needs to steady you until sunset, and declare, "The Lord is my banner."